Dagger Hollow was a town trapped in time. It felt like a place forgotten by the rest of the world. Old cars with fins of rust sat parked on the quiet streets. The neon sign of the diner, Mabel's Eats, flickered with a tired pink glow, but the seats inside were always empty. No one ever seemed to be around. A thick, heavy fog rolled in from the surrounding woods every single evening. It crept between the houses like a silent monster, swallowing everything in a blanket of grey. The fog was so dense you could barely see your own hand in front of your face. It made the world feel small and suffocating, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The woods around Dagger Hollow were even worse. Tall, skeletal trees, with twisted branches clawed at the sky. Their dark shapes looked like lurking giants in the gloom. Locals whispered stories about those woods, stories of strange lights and hushed voices that drifted on the wind. They said things got lost in there, not just car keys or pets, but people. The pathways seemed to change on their own, leading you in circles until you were hopelessly lost. The air grew cold the deeper you went, and a feeling of being watched would crawl up your spine. It was a place you learned to avoid, a place where the shadows seemed to have teeth. Even the buildings held a sense of dread. The old movie theatre had been closed for decades, its marquee letters spelling out a forgotten film title. Paint peeled from the walls of the houses in long, curling strips like sunburnt skin. Windows stared out like vacant eyes, dark and empty. The silence was the most unsettling part. There were no children laughing, no dogs barking, no cars rumbling down the main street. The only sound was the lonely hum of the flickering streetlights and the soft, wet drip of condensation from the eaves. Dagger Hollow was a town drowning in its own quiet misery. A perfect stage for a nightmare. At the edge of town, perched on a lonely hill overlooking the foggy valley, stood the skeletal remains of WDGR radio. It was a burnt-out husk, a jagged silhouette against the perpetually grey sky. The station had burned down in a terrible fire back in the 1990s, a tragedy that the older folks in town never spoke about. The fire had taken the life of its only late-night host, a man named Vincent Black. Now the station was just a ruin, its walls blackened with soot and its windows shattered. It looked like a giant tombstone, a constant, grim reminder of a past that refused to stay buried. One Tuesday night, something strange happened. It started as a faint crackle, a whisper of sound breaking through the oppressive silence of Dagger Hollow. Old radios, dusty and forgotten on kitchen counters and in dusty garages, began to hum. At first, people thought it was nothing, just interference from the thick fog or a passing storm, but the sound grew louder, a persistent hiss of static that filled the air. It was an old sound, the kind you heard on radios from a long, long time ago. The static seemed to crawl into every corner of every house, an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. Then, through the sea of white noise, a voice emerged. It was a man's voice, smooth and low, like velvet soaked in poison. It was a classic radio announcer's voice, the kind that belonged to a bygone era of swing music and black and white television. "You are listening to WDGR," the voice crooned, its words stretching out slowly. The voice of Dagger Hollow. "We're back on the air." A cold chill ran through the few residents who heard it. WDGR? That was impossible. The station was a ruin. It had been silent for 30 years. They must be imagining it. They had to be. The voice continued, its tone calm and unsettlingly cheerful. It spoke of old town events, of bake sales and high school football games from decades ago. It was as if time had rewound and the town was living in the past. After a few minutes of this strange, nostalgic chatter, the broadcast changed. The voice began to call out names. "Good evening, Mr. Abernathy," it would say. "I hope your roses are blooming." The next day, old Mr. Abernathy's prize-winning roses had all withered and died, their petals turned to black dust. The radio voice was like a curse whispered on the airwaves. Fear began to spread through Dagger Hollow like a virus. People started unplugging their radios, stuffing them in closets, or even smashing them to pieces, but it did no good. The broadcast seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. You could hear it faintly in the hum of a refrigerator, in the whistle of the wind through a keyhole, or in the static between television channels. The voice of Vincent Black, the dead radio host, had returned from the grave. And it seemed he had a message for the town, a message delivered one name at a time. The town was no longer just quiet, it was terrified. Eliza Kane was not like the other teenagers in Dagger Hollow, if you could even find any. She was 16, with a mind full of questions and a passion for the strange and unexplained. While others stayed inside, she was out exploring, recording her adventures for her little-known podcast, Hollow Truths. She wasn't scared of the fog or the silent streets. She was fascinated by them. The town's creepy atmosphere was her playground. So, when the ghostly broadcasts of WDGR started, Eliza wasn't just scared, she was intrigued. This was the biggest mystery Dagger Hollow had ever seen, and she was going to be the one to solve it. Armed with her phone and a heavy-duty flashlight, Eliza decided to do what no one else dared. She was going to investigate the source. She was going to the old, burnt-out radio station on the hill. Her parents warned her not to go. They told her it was dangerous, that the building was unstable. But Eliza knew their fear was about more than just falling debris. They were afraid of the station's past, of the fire, of the ghost that now haunted the airwaves. Their fear only fueled her determination. She had to know what was happening. She had to get the story for her podcast. The walk up the hill was eerie. The fog was thicker here, swirling around her ankles like ghostly hands trying to pull her back. The silence was broken only by the crunch of her sneakers on the gravel path, and the distant, maddening crackle of static that seemed to follow her. As she got closer, the smell of old smoke and damp decay filled the air. The station loomed before her, a black skeleton against the pale moon. It looked even more menacing up close. A broken sign that once read WWDGR swung from a single hinge, creaking rhythmically in the slight breeze. It sounded like a slow, sad goodbye. Taking a deep breath, Eliza slipped through a gap where a door used to be. Inside, it was a disaster zone. The floor was a mess of charred wood, melted plastic, and shattered glass. Moonlight streamed through holes in the roof, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like ghostly figures. The air was thick with the smell of ash and something else, something sweet and rotten. It was a place of death and decay. But for Eliza, it was a treasure trove of clues. She was standing at the epicenter of the haunting, and she was ready to dig for the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. Eliza moved cautiously through the main studio, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The control panel was a melted wreck, a tombstone of knobs and switches frozen in their final moments. Wires hung from the ceiling like dead vines. It was hard to believe any sound could ever come from this place again. Yet, the faint sound of static seemed to be all around her, humming from the very walls. She ran her hand over a soot-covered countertop and felt something beneath the ash. It was a stack of papers, somehow spared from the worst of the fire. She carefully brushed them off. They were broadcast schedules from 1995, the year of the fire. Eliza's eyes scanned the neat, typed lines. She saw playlists for forgotten songs and advertisements for businesses that no longer existed. Then she saw the name of the late-night show, Vincent Black's Dagger Hollow After Dark. A shiver traced its way down her spine. This was his studio. This was where he had died. She felt like an intruder, a trespasser in a dead man's tomb. The feeling of being watched intensified, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, to lean in closer as if trying to read over her shoulder. Deeper inside the station, she found a small, less damaged office. A metal filing cabinet stood against one wall, its paint blistered but its drawers still intact. With a loud groan of protesting metal, she managed to pull one open. Inside were rows of cassette tapes, their plastic cases warped from the heat. The labels were handwritten in a looping, elegant script. They were recordings of Vincent Black's old shows. Eliza stuffed a handful of them into her backpack. This was evidence. This was real, tangible proof of the man behind the ghostly voice. She felt a surge of excitement mixed with a cold knot of fear. As she was about to leave the office, her flashlight beam caught something else. It was a photograph tacked to a corkboard on the wall. The edges were curled and yellowed, but the image was clear. It showed a group of townspeople standing outside the radio station, smiling and waving. They looked happy, celebrating the station's anniversary. In the center of the group was a man with dark, intense eyes and a slick, confident smile. A caption was written underneath: Vincent Black and his loyal listeners, 1995. Eliza stared at the faces, a cold realization dawning on her. She recognized some of them. They were the same people whose names the ghost had called out on the radio. Back in the safety of her bedroom, Eliza listened to the old cassette tapes. Her room was her sanctuary, filled with posters of her favorite bands and the comforting glow of her laptop screen. But tonight, it felt different. The room felt cold. As she pushed a tape into her old cassette player, the familiar hiss of static filled the silence before my voice poured out of the speakers. It was the same smooth, confident voice from the ghostly broadcast. But this time it was alive. It was charming. I talked about the town with such passion, calling it the beating heart of the valley. She listened for hours, tape after tape. I knew everything about everyone. I knew who was having a baby, who had lost a pet, who was secretly in love with whom. I called my listeners my family and my show a nightly get-together. But as Eliza listened more closely, she noticed a strange undercurrent to my words. There was a possessiveness in my tone, a subtle darkness behind the charming facade. I spoke of the townspeople as if they belonged to me. I wasn't just a host. I was a gatekeeper, a collector of secrets. I seemed to enjoy the power I held over the small, isolated community. One tape was different from the others. The audio quality was poor, filled with shouting and the crackle of what sounded like fire. It must have been recorded on the night the station burned down. Eliza leaned in closer, straining to hear. She could make out my voice, but it wasn't smooth anymore. It was filled with rage and desperation. "You can't leave!" I screamed over the roar of the flames. "This town is mine! You all belong to me! I won't let you tune me out!" Then there were other voices, panicked and frightened, shouting my name. They were pleading with me. It sounded like they had gone to the station to confront me. A sudden, jarring click on the tape was followed by an unearthly silence. Then a new sound began. It was a low, rhythmic chant. I was listing names. Abernathy, Miller, Thompson. It was the same pattern as the ghostly broadcasts. Eliza's blood ran cold. The fire wasn't an accident. The townspeople, my loyal listeners from the photograph, had tried to stop me from doing something. They had trapped me in the fire, and I had died cursing their names. Now my ghost was back to finish the list. I wasn't just haunting the town, I was hunting it. The haunting escalated. It was no longer confined to the radio. Shadows in Dagger Hollow began to move on their own, stretching and twisting into unnatural shapes. Whispers followed people down the empty streets, calling their names in Vincent Black's silky voice. Lights would flicker and die in perfect time with the static pulses from the phantom station. The town was under siege by a ghost who commanded the very airwaves and shadows. Fear was a constant companion, a cold presence that sat beside you at the dinner table and watched you while you slept. The town was a prison, and Vincent was the warden. Eliza became a primary target. The ghost seemed to know she was investigating. Her podcast equipment would turn on by itself, broadcasting static-filled recordings of her own voice, twisted and distorted. Her laptop screen would flash with images of the burnt-out radio station. One night she woke up to find the words "You're next" written in condensation on her bedroom window. The message was clear. Vincent Black knew she was listening, and he didn't like it. He was playing with her, turning her own tools against her, making her feel as helpless as everyone else in town. Her mind started to play tricks on her. Was that a floorboard creaking downstairs, or was it the ghost of Vincent Black climbing the stairs? Was the whisper she heard just the wind, or was it his voice promising what he was going to do to her? The line between reality and the supernatural was blurring. She saw his face in reflections, a fleeting glimpse of his dark eyes and cruel smile in shop windows and puddles on the street. The psychological toll was immense. She wasn't just investigating a ghost story anymore, she was living in one, and she was the main character. The worst came during a thunderstorm. The power went out, plunging the entire town into darkness. Eliza's phone, her only source of light, suddenly crackled to life. It wasn't a call, it was the broadcast. Vincent Black's voice came through the tiny speaker, not smooth and charming, but cold and full of malice. "I see you, Eliza Kane," he whispered. "The little podcaster, the little busybody. You love a good story, don't you? Well, I'm going to give you a killer ending." The voice was no longer coming from the radio. It was coming from inside her own phone. He was everywhere. The list of names grew shorter. With each name called out over the spectral airwaves, another strange tragedy would befall a resident of Dagger Hollow. Mr. Miller, the town mechanic, was found trapped in his garage, the door mysteriously jammed shut. Mrs. Thompson, the librarian, swore she saw ghostly figures moving between the bookshelves before she fled the library in terror, never to return. The ghost of Vincent Black was methodically working his way through the people in the photograph, the ones who had confronted him on that fateful night. He was picking them off one by one, using fear as his weapon. Eliza knew she was running out of time. She looked at the photograph again, her eyes scanning the smiling faces, now twisted by tragedy. She recognized almost all of them. These weren't just names on a list, they were her neighbors. They were the quiet, withdrawn people who had lived in Dagger Hollow their whole lives, carrying a dark secret. She finally understood their fear and their silence. They had created this monster, and now it was back to claim them. They were prisoners of their own past, haunted by the ghost they had helped make. Then, one evening, as the fog rolled in thicker than ever, the radio crackled to life with a new energy. The static was louder, more aggressive. Vincent Black's voice boomed through the town, filled with a triumphant rage. He had called out the last name from the original group. His revenge seemed complete, but the broadcast didn't stop. There was a long, chilling pause, filled only with the sound of hissing static. Eliza held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs. She knew what was coming next. She felt it in the cold air, in the pit of her stomach. And now, Vincent's voice whispered, dropping to a personal, terrifyingly intimate tone that seemed meant only for her, for the girl who couldn't leave well enough alone, the one who dug up the past. The static swelled, and then her own name echoed through the night, distorted and cruel. Eliza Kane. It was not a question, it was a death sentence. He had finished with the past, and now he was turning his attention to the present. He was coming for her. Her investigation had put her at the top of a brand new list. Eliza knew she had only one choice. She couldn't run, she couldn't hide. He was in the airwaves, in the shadows, in the technology she used every day. To fight him, she had to go to his turf. She had to face him at the source of his power, the WDGR radio station. It was Halloween night. The fog was so thick it felt like a physical wall, and the air crackled with supernatural energy. She grabbed her podcasting gear, her microphone, her laptop and a portable transmitter. If Vincent Black wanted to make her part of his broadcast, she would give him one he'd never forget. She was going to broadcast live. She arrived at the burnt-out station to find it strangely transformed. Ghostly blue and red lights flickered inside, mimicking the on-air and applause signs of a live studio. The air hummed with power. Stepping inside, she saw him. The ghost of Vincent Black was standing by the melted control panel, but he wasn't a whisper or a shadow anymore. He was a shimmering, semi-translucent figure, dressed in the slick clothes from his photograph. He looked solid, real. He turned his head slowly and his dark eyes fixed on her. A cruel, welcoming smile spread across his face. "Welcome to the show, Eliza," he hissed. "It's over, Vincent," Eliza said, her voice trembling but firm. She set up her equipment on a blackened table. "I'm broadcasting this. Everyone is going to hear the truth, what you did, what they did to you." She was hijacking his signal, sending out her own voice over his haunted frequency. The ghost laughed, a sound like grinding glass. "The truth?" he mocked. "The truth is that they tried to silence me. This town, these people, they are my audience. They belong to me, and now so do you. You will be my new co-host, forever." As she spoke into the microphone, telling the story of the fire and the curse, the studio erupted in chaos. Objects flew through the air, the temperature plummeted. Vincent's form flickered and grew, his voice booming around her, trying to drown her out. He was fighting for control of his airwaves. It was a battle of wills, a showdown between the living and the dead, broadcast live for the whole cursed town to hear. Eliza kept talking, her voice gaining strength. She wasn't just telling a story. She was performing an exorcism, using the truth as her weapon against the ghost's hateful energy. The final confrontation was a storm of supernatural fury. Vincent Black's ghost swelled into a monstrous vortex of static and shadow, his screams echoing with the rage of 30 years of silence. "This is my station!" he roared, the very walls of the ruin shaking around Eliza. "My town, my broadcast." But Eliza did not back down. She held her microphone tight, her own voice cutting through the chaos. She spoke of his loneliness, his possessive rage, and the town's fear that had fed his spirit for decades. She wasn't just fighting him, she was trying to reason with the last shred of the man he once was. Suddenly, with a final, desperate scream of pure static, the ghost of Vincent Black lunged at her. He wasn't trying to scare her anymore, he was trying to consume her, to pull her into his shadowy existence. Eliza shut her eyes and shouted the last words she could think of into her microphone. "You're off the air, Vincent. The show is over." There was a blinding flash of white light, an ear-splitting sound like 1,000 radios switching off at once, and then silence. A deafening, absolute silence. The flickering lights died. The cold vanished. The air was still. When Eliza opened her eyes, the ghost was gone. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted. For the first time since she could remember, the air in Dagger Hollow felt clean, light. She had done it. She had won. Exhausted but triumphant, she packed up her gear. As she stepped out of the ruined station, she saw the fog beginning to retreat, slinking back into the woods. The first rays of the morning sun were breaking over the horizon. It felt like the town could finally wake up from its long, terrible nightmare. She had faced the ghost and lived to tell the tale. She walked down the hill and back into town. But something was wrong. The streets were completely empty, not just quiet but deserted. Houses were vacant, their doors hanging open. Cars were stopped in the middle of the road, empty. The diner's neon sign was dark. There was no one. A newspaper caught by the wind skittered across the pavement. Eliza picked it up. The date was October 31st, 1995. A chill colder than any ghost's touch crept over her. She looked at her hands. They were pale, almost translucent in the morning light. A faint crackle of static buzzed in her ears. Vincent was gone, but his curse remained. In defeating him, she had taken his place. The town hadn't vanished. She had. She was the new ghost of Dagger Hollow, doomed to wander its empty streets, forever part of the last broadcast.